A Vitalist argument for voluntary human extinction. 1. A working definition of vitalism. Often, people confuse vitalism as a trait of another encompassing ethical system. Orthodox Christianity, Islam, and many types of paganism and animism contain vitalistic elements, but other ethical priorities still overshadow strength within their moral zeitgeist. Love overrides strength more often than any other Christian virtue. Love's robustness as a cultural pathogen resides partially in the philosopher's inability to agree on a single definition of love. Where did this virus love originate? Who birthed it? Nietzsche answered this question in the preface of Beyond Good and Evil. Christianity is Platonism for the common people, and, of all errors thus far, the most grievous, protracted, and dangerous has been Plato's invention of pure spirit and of transcendental goodness. This view matures in the subsequent book in Nietzsche's anthology, The Genealogy of Morals, in which he divides the blame for Christian idealism and Christian love between Plato and Jesus. Plato contributed the transcendental, rationalistic, intellectual, Faustian aspect of Christian love. He also contributed to the Gentile acceptance of Jewish mythology. Only one concerned entirely with the transcendental good could accept that God chose a different race. Jesus gave us the modern Western forms of pity, monastic internalization, anti-rationality, for instance, surpasses all understanding, from Philippians 4:7, unconditionality, self-effacement, and, above all, the apotheosis of punishment as love. Punishment as the payment of a fee stipulated for by the power which protects the evildoer from the excesses of revenge. Nietzsche expressed his positive visions for the future in tiny, lightning-like flashes, while his critiques cover pages, because he could only express vitalism simply. Even though Nietzsche exulted in both, this ideology rejects all flowery language. When Nietzsche talked about love, or about power, or about freedom, or about the Übermensch, he meant strength. Strength does not necessarily imply health, although across a century, a healthier society will, of course, retain more strength. I cannot define strength because you already know it too well. You wear many masks, and the deepest one hungers for nothing except it. You can't remove this mask, you can only layer more on top. If you tried to discard it, you would not find anything underneath. Strength does not only define my values, it also provides the best metric for the evaluation of metaphysical planes. When you send soldiers into battle, do you plan based on anything besides your knowledge of physics, psychology, and history? What about when you try to make a woman love you? Curtis Yarvin identifies Puritanism as the direct ancestor of liberalism, but he does not go far enough. You have heard of the pipeline from university to social justice, but have you heard of the pipeline from lower middle class church to intersectionality? Every Sunday, from the ages of 4 to 17, my parents would load me and my siblings into one of their cars and we'd go to a park to climb on rusty social monkey bars with Kids Kingdom or the Teen Ministry after singing songs like God is love, in him there is no darkness, let us walk in his light, his children one and all, for 45 minutes. As a very small child, this ritual bored me, and I tried to avoid it, even more than I tried to avoid school. However, the ice cream social evangelizers eventually corroded my spirit and mutated me into a vampire. Every year, I rode the bus back home from the week-long teen camp, pale, bloodless, and certain of my eternal damnation. Lust, excitement, and twinges of embarrassed jealousy kept me sane at church. I remember a slightly older girl in my teen ministry who would sit on boys' laps during social events in front of millennial teen leaders. Every time I rode to an event, I would inwardly salivate with the girls, especially this one. At the age of 16, she kissed me in my car and then told me about her experience sucking off one of the other girls' brothers. Every year at teen camp, among the early morning Bible studies, PSAs against weed, pop, soggy biscuit and gravy, and powdered eggs, the powers that be would catch, lecture, expose, and exile at least one couple for fucking. I knew a pair of girls who brought 14 joints and 2 pairs of sunglasses to teen camp and wandered around all week in a wonderful, paranoid aesthetic daze, but the bitches didn't share with me. I also knew a girl in this scene who left her parents waiting during a game of D&D to give her brother in Christ a hand job in her bathroom. I don't write these facts down to shame sluts, but to point out the incongruence between the strict sexual code. For instance, girls could not wear tank tops at teen camp, and the behavior of the flock, and to destroy any ideas about the traditionalizing force of evangelical Christianity. Many of these girls expressed true faith in God and love for Him, even to their co-conspirators. Today, all these waifs take antidepressants and post Instagram reels in support of BLM. Some of them have hyphenated their last names. Some still trek to church. The church retreats to the left, and its flock retreats with it. When conservative men talk about equality, they mean equity. When art history majors talk about equality, they mean love. Christianity birthed liberalism. Some have called left-wing ideology a parasite on Western civilization, but it only occupies this category in the same way a baby sucking on its mother's breast does. Humanist atheism evolved from Christianity. 2. Two different visions of the last man. David Hume once elucidated the main problem with the field of ethics by claiming that no metaphysical description, no description of things, can ever yield information about values. In the absence of a priori ethical precepts, no one can say anything about the ethics of a man torturing a small child. They can only say, "I don't like that he did that." They can still organize a militia to hunt the man down and kill him, but subjective values motivate them. You can still function without projecting meaning onto the world. If you have not read C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, you should. He exposed how liberal Western intellectuals sissify all aspects of life under the guise of rationality, even though their rational values do not contain any objective content. At the end of the essay, he also attacks skepticism and completely subjective ethical systems and upholds a Tao of objective morality. Lewis agreed with Hume that objective reality doesn't ejaculate any values. However, he argued that a Tao, a natural, true ethical system, still exists, and that every society acknowledges some form of this Tao. Perhaps they don't agree about all the same rules, but ethical evolution will, given a long enough timescale, still synthesize these branches of the Tao into the same dynamic imperatives. Lewis saw a nightmare in any future society which successfully destroys humanity's need for the Tao, the society of Lewis's last man.
无条件爱，条件 means condition 无条件 unconditional love. When you have a condition, power is limited. Human will have a limited power. Tao source heaven has a huge power. You want to gain abilities to serve humanity. You have some dream. Go ahead. You got to learn the secret technique.
So Master Sha will join us very shortly. As we wait for Master Sha, why don't we prepare our soul, heart, mind, and body to be with Master Sha as we prepare to welcome him, so we can close our eyes.
In The Abolition, Lewis incorrectly characterized Nietzsche as evangelizing an ethic of bricks and centipedes, a robotic ethic. However, Nietzsche pronounced that ethics are only for cows, and his works deal only with humans. He worshipped superhumans, not robots. You can see this clearly in his negative ideal, Nietzsche and Zarathustra's Last Man. It influenced many of the writers who succeeded him. Maxim Gorky gave a great, succinct description of Nietzsche's Last Man in his Bystander, from the voice of a rich man named Lutov. And after that, he himself will limit himself with his will. Man is a coward. Man is greedy. He's clever because he's a coward, exactly for that reason. Allow him to become frightened of himself, give him permission to do so, and you'll obtain most excellent and timid and businesslike people who will, without any loss of time, abbreviate themselves to the God of sufficient until the day is the good thereof, and so to a peaceful existence. And in Thus Spake Zarathustra, Nietzsche takes the first snapshot of his last man like this. When Zarathustra had spoken these words, he again looked at the people and was silent. There they stand, he said to his heart. There they laugh. They understand me not. I am not the mouth for these ears. Must one first batter their ears, that they may learn to hear with their eyes? Must one clatter like kettle drums and penitential preachers? Or do they only believe the stammerer? They have something whereof they are proud. What do they call it, that which maketh them proud? Culture, they call it. It distinguisheth them from the goatherds. They dislike, therefore, to hear of contempt of themselves. So I will appeal to their pride. I will speak unto them of the most contemptible thing. That, however, is the last man. And thus spake Zarathustra unto the people. It is time for man to fix his goal. It is time for man to plant the germ of his highest hope. Still is his soil rich enough for it, but that soil will one day be poor and exhausted, and no lofty tree will any longer be able to grow thereon. Alas, there cometh the time when man will no longer launch the arrow of his longing beyond man, and the string of his bow will have unlearned to whiz. I tell you, one must still have chaos in one to give birth to a dancing star. I tell you, ye still have chaos in you. Alas, there cometh the time when man will no longer give birth to any star. Alas, there cometh the time of the most despicable man, who can no longer despise himself. Lo, I show you the last man. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? So asketh the last man and blinketh. The earth hath then become small, and on it there hoppeth the last man who maketh everything small. His species is ineradicable, like that of the ground flea. The last man liveth longest. We have discovered happiness, say the last man, and blink thereby. They have left the regions where it is hard to live, for they need warmth. One still loveth one's neighbor, and rubbeth against him for one needeth warmth. Turning ill and being distrustful, they consider sinful. They walk warily. He is a fool who still stumbleth over stones or men. A little poison now and then, that maketh pleasant dreams, and much poison at last for a pleasant death. As you can see, I myself am the last man, a good example of one. One still worketh, for work is a pastime, but one is careful lest the pastime should hurt one. One no longer becometh poor or rich, both are too burdensome. Who still wanteth to rule? Who still wanteth to obey? Both are too burdensome. No shepherd and one herd. Everyone wanteth the same, everyone is equal. He who hath other sentiments goeth voluntarily into the madhouse. Formerly, all the world was insane, say the subtlest of them, and blink thereby. They are clever, and know all that hath happened. So there is no end to their raillery. People still fall out, but are soon reconciled. Otherwise, it spoileth their stomachs. They have their little pleasures for the day, and their little pleasures for the night, but they have a regard for health. We have discovered happiness, say the last men, and blink thereby. And here ended the first discourse of Zarathustra, which is also called the prologue, for at this point the shouting and mirth of the multitude interrupted him. Give us this last man, O Zarathustra, they called out. Make us into these last men. Then will we make thee a present of the Superman. And all the people exulted and smacked their lips. Zarathustra, however, turned sad and said to his heart, They understand me not. I am not the mouth for these ears. Too long, perhaps, have I lived in the mountains. Too much have I hearkened unto the brooks and trees. Now do I speak unto them as unto the goatherds. Calm is my soul and clear, like the mountains in the morning. But they think me cold and a mocker with terrible jests. And now do they look at me and laugh, and while they laugh they hate me too. There is ice in their laughter. Recently, I have heard some intellectuals in dissident, Catholic, and Nietzschean spheres equate these two last men. However, I think that on a battlefield, these two, that being the last man of C.S. Lewis and the last man of Nietzsche, would wage war on opposite sides. In fact, Lewis's conditioner resembles the Übermensch, and Nietzsche's last man resembles a man in love with the Tao. Compare these two statements. Lewis, criticizing subjectivity. He merely snatches at some one precept, on which the accidents of time and place happen to have riveted his attention, and then rides it to death, for no reason that he can give. And from thus spake Zarathustra, I love him who desireth not too many virtues. One virtue is more of a virtue than two, because it is more of a knot for one's destiny to cling to. Only one who thinks he can perceive the objective morality behind reality can fall for the naivety of certainty. Nietzsche's last man thinks that he has found the Tao. Has any man not seen, in the rat-like eyes of the bugman, a complete certainty in his definition of the good and a greater certainty in his enemy's evilness? In the abolition, Lewis argued that the Tao included elements of Christian, pagan, Hindu, Confucian, and Taoist thought. Although these schools taught different moralities, Lewis believed that they shared the same foundation. For instance, comparing Confucius's silver rule, "What I do not wish others to do unto me, I also wish not to do unto others," Analects 5:12, to Jesus's golden rule, "Therefore all things whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them, for this is the law and the prophets." Matthew 7:12, King James Version. Lewis stated that the golden merely extends the silver. This argument has convinced many, but he snuck completely subjective moral values into his argument about objective morality to make this comparison. The golden rule appears as a natural extension of the silver rule because Lewis views both after having already accepted the golden rule a priori. I could similarly invoke this same logic to claim that the law, "kill all thieves," naturally extends the law, "imprison all thieves." Chinese people totally reject the golden rule. I worked in a coffee shop on the campus of a school with a massive Chinese population, and of the customers with Chinese accents, about 15% ever tipped me and my coworkers. Some came every day. Lewis's version of the Tao only entails the moral, social, and political practices of race-blind conservative Catholics. Pope Francis provides the greatest moral exemplar of this boring Pharisaism. If the old ideal continues, you will walk to Detroit 20 years from now and see the Tao's final form. No one will rob you. No one in Detroit will contain the energy necessary to rob you. Crime only occurs while those with some energy exist to displace those without any. Everyone will stare at you from identical duplexes and blink. More likely, American borders will open completely and a horde of Africans will wipe Detroit off the face of the earth. Only the West and Christianity produce the Tao, and the Tao eventually produces the weakest man imaginable. What can those who follow Jesus' ideal expect, except crucifixion? By the end of his life, Dostoevsky knew this. Scholars of Russian literature say that the death of his son prompted him to plan a sequel to the brothers Karamazov, describing the downfall of Alyosha, the most spiritual of the three brothers. This would have raised cold intellectuality and even animalistic hedonism above Western spirituality, and could have prevented the rise of the Bolsheviks. Russian Orthodoxy only adopted fanatical anti-Soviet rhetoric and only canonized the last royal family as a response to their own exile. Communism and Christianity did not oppose each other in the beginning of the 20th century. Tolstoy, the face of Anglophilia, as Curtis Yarvin points out, inspired the leaders of the Russian Revolution with one hand while writing extremely orthodox, prudish manifestos like the Kreutzer Sonata with the other. Yuri Slezkin provides many more examples of this two-pronged worship of weakness in his great genealogy, The Jewish Century. For instance, O.V. Aptekamen, whose father was one of the pioneers of Russian education among the Jews of Pavlodar, found both the gospel and the people in the shape of Parasha Bukharashina, the radiant image of a peasant girl in the Pskov province in 1874. I was a socialist, and Parasha a Christian, but emotionally we were alike. I was ready for all kinds of sacrifices, and she was all about self-sacrifice. And so my first pupil, Parasha, accepted my interpretation of the gospel and became a socialist too. I was in a state of exaltation, which was to some extent religious. It was a complex and rather confused mental state in which a genuine socialist worldview oh my God, man, get coexisted. Jesus Christ. It was a complex and rather confused mental state in which a genuine socialist worldview coexisted with the Christian one. Solomon Wittenberg, according to his disciple M.A. Morianus, was a promising Talmudist when, at the age of 9, he learned Russian and persuaded his parents to let him attend the Nikolaev Gymnasium. In August 1879, on the night before his execution for an attempt on the life of Alexander II, and one day after his refusal to convert to Christianity, he wrote to his friends, most of whom were young Jewish rebels, "Dear friends, naturally, I do not want to die. To say that I am dying willingly would be a lie on my part. But let this circumstance not cast a shadow on my faith or on the certainty of my convictions. Remember that the highest example of the love of humanity and self-sacrifice was, undoubtedly, the Savior. Yet even he prayed, 'Take this cup away from me.' Consequently, how can I not pray for the same thing? Like him, I tell myself, if no other way is possible, if for the triumph of socialism it is necessary that my blood be shed, if others can make the transition from the present order to a better one only by trampling over our dead bodies, then let our blood be shed, let it redeem humanity. For I do not doubt that our blood will fertilize the soil from which the seed of socialism will sprout, and that socialism will triumph, and triumph soon. This is my faith. Here again I recall the words of the Savior. Truly I say unto you, not many of those present here relish death as the coming of the heavenly kingdom. Of this I am convinced as much as I am convinced that the earth moves, and when I climb the scaffold and the rope tightens around my neck, my last thought will be, and still it moves and nothing in the world can stop its movement." Can you see the connection between our current ideology and the Buddhist worship of death? Can you see the evidence of liberalism's birth from Christianity's womb? The Tao asks you to sacrifice yourself. Nietzsche only asks you to throw self-sacrifice away and embrace your own life. Dissidents should distance themselves from Christianity. Until they do, liberalisms will continue to hold the moral high ground despite any atrocities they commit, simply because their worldview allows for more self-sacrifice than a traditional one. The cross shows that Christianity upholds self-sacrifice as the highest virtue. The old ideal worked for a while, but has died and has begun to rot. You cannot uproot a tree while clinging to one of the tree's branches. Lewis correctly critiqued Western intellectuals' use of the word instinct to promote their own subjective values as objective. But he didn't understand that instinct, the Christian instinct to moralism and self-sacrifice, drove his own writing process completely. Nietzsche wrote to influence men's instincts, not their souls. Ironically, this self-sacrifice exists only as a form of the will to power. As Solomon Wittenberg exemplified, self-sacrifice attracts revolutionaries because it provides a path to attention, importance, and power. Even when you submit to Allah or to DEI committees, you submit to grasp power. in the form of 40 virgins or a lateral promotion. The essence of your being cries out for vitality. Throughout Lewis's essay, he deconstructed the values of others as subjective while conflating his own values with objectivity. Lewis hated power, and any 18th century philosopher would have considered him a lib. Posterity models the instinct of love for children. However, he confused the model and intellectuals who know the model with what the model intends to describe: hairless apes. Here you can see Aleister Crowley's initial genius and latent insanity on display. Do as thou wilt doesn't need to become the whole of the wall. The whole of the wall? Do as thou wilt doesn't need to become the whole of the law. Do as thou wilt is the whole of the law. No one has ever observed transcendental punishment. If they did, they would immediately subject it to physical laws which govern the transcendental subject, as Kant continuously pointed out. Abandon all values or succumb to decay. Free yourself from all tired humanism. I have heard of rabbis who testify that God envies humans. If I cannot convince you to give up your guilt and your repentance, at least heed this advice. Do not fall for any heresies like this. This type of self-satisfaction makes the last man stagnate instead of killing himself by despising the world. If you must embrace the ascetic ideal, do not find satisfaction in anything but death. Mummify yourself while still alive like an ancient Japanese Vajrayana monk, or castrate yourself like a crazed Russian mystic. Do not cravenly hope for a better afterlife, just dive into the void. Make a religion out of Ecclesiastes. Do not deceive yourself. Already, every time you pray in the dust god's name. Even when martyring themselves, liberal fanatics can never attain this kind of grace because they don't have the balls. In every way that Christianity fails, liberalism flails towards increasingly ugly and deranged practices. Just observe one moral exemplar of this curse: Michel Foucault. Someone needs to write a good biography of this man. If I wrote one, I would call it Pitch Black or Pure Evil. A communist named James Miller wrote a hagiography about him, The Passion of Michel Foucault, which currently stands as the most famous of his biographies. Miller describes his masochistic sexual practices fittingly. He joined again in the orgies of torture, trembling with the most exquisite agonies, voluntarily effacing himself, exploding the limits of consciousness, letting real corporeal pain insensibly melt into pleasure through the alchemy of eroticism. Through intoxication, reverie, the Dionysian abandon of the artist, the most punishing of ascetic practices, and an uninhibited exploration of sadomasochistic eroticism, it seemed possible to breach, however briefly, the boundaries separating the conscious and unconscious, reason and unreason, pleasure and pain, and, at the ultimate limit, life and death, thus starkly revealing how distinctions central to the play of true and false are pliable, uncertain, contingent. Foucault himself may have used a deep and dark skepticism to free himself from the bounds of all morality and turn himself into a monster. Or he may have used fashionable catchwords like Nietzscheanism, power, repression, sexuality, Dionysian, and communism to justify his lifestyle. I do not know. I cannot see into a dead man's soul. However, his legacy, not himself, affects us, and James Miller provides a perfect summary of his legacy. Even while abandoning himself to sadomasochistic sexual practices, Western man finds a need to cover himself with the ascetic ideal. James Miller accomplishes each of the hallmarks of the Christian ideal in this passage: hatred of the flesh, love of the transcendental, and an immense faith in a final, pleasurable resting place free from the burden of embodied understanding. Nothing exists except reality, and nothing can transcend it. Let me describe one of these ascetic practices, which breached the boundaries separating the conscious and unconscious, reasoning and unreason, pleasure and pain, life and death, true and false. Michel Foucault praised fisting. He enjoyed it when total strangers stuck their entire fists up his rectum, often violently, tearing the flesh. Liberals praise him now, not despite this, but because of it, because he effaced himself and obtained aids from it. Can you see the influence of liberalism's moral ancestor? Foucault, with a stranger's fist up his ass, has replaced Jesus Christ on the cross. The ideal has decayed, but no one has replaced it. Of course, James Miller does not mention that Foucault experimented on Tunisian boys as young as 7 with the same ascetic practices which he subjected himself to. No one on the left will ever care about this. In their minds, he has purified himself in the crucible of self-effacement and victimhood, and nothing in this world can touch him. Many minds work this way. I once saw a Christian dissident watch an anarcho-communist cartoon about the ideal society and announce that the libs want the same thing as Catholic conservatives but cannot attain it because they don't know God. I would rather ride with the orcs for Sauron's glory. Every day I wake up feeling a great dread that all this purifying suffering will come to nothing, and a horde of middle-aged mothers will lead a tribe of traditionalist Christian Uyghurs into power. If the type of vaguely right-wing man who works part-time as a Protestant pastor, homeschools his children, and takes his fat family to Disneyland once a year ever sits on the throne, Western men will once again open their borders and stop reproducing within 2 generations at most. 3. Misconceptions about entropy. Strong men and great ideas flourished in the millennia after the fall of the Roman Empire, arguably more than in classical times, despite Christ's leash. I remember pondering this and watching the rain fall from gutters into the homeless gaping sores. I walked the streets of Vancouver in the middle of the night, all along East Hastings, and witnessed the rats crawl from tent to tent. The homeless people all bent over and faced the ground as they walked, as if the night sky would blind them. Vancouver formed a wind tunnel straight down the street, and on this night I saw many of the walking dead lose to the wind whatever they happened to hold in their hands, without even looking back to retrieve it. Then I arrived at a party full of well-educated high life thrown close to the summit of hedonism, and I reflected that, perhaps, one type of life cannot exist without the other. Many fear the second law of thermodynamics, and rightly so. In physical laws like this, nature displays all her grandeur, extravagance, and indifference. It has brought strong men to their knees and has raced dwarfs to the heights of power. However, make sure that you fear this immense force for the right reasons. I do not know when it started, but at some point, dissidents began to equate liberalism with entropy. Liberalism conquers only because it moves along the path of least resistance, along the path of entropy. And entropy means replacing well-ordered hierarchies with a chaotic, universal, lowest common denominator. However, entropy does the exact opposite. Consider Boltzmann's entropy formula. This formula states that the entropy, S, of a macrostate, a system of particles, depends on the number of permutations of microstates, any state of the system that satisfies the definition given by the macrostate. The board game Catan, in which 2 dice are rolled each turn, provides a great example of entropy. The sum of the 2 dice, thus macrostate, with the maximum entropy is 7, because 7 allows for the largest number of permutations of each die, and thus the largest number of microstates. Or in the same way, in a system of particles with a distribution of energies, the entropy of a macrostate with a given energy goes up with the number of permutations of a particle's energies which the sum of energies allows for. This formulation of entropy is always true for systems in which the volume, energy, and number of particles are held constant. The nature of entropy becomes even more clear when you consider Gibbs' formula for entropy in the NVT ensemble, a more general case in which temperature and not energy is held constant, like in the case of the Earth, where P sub I is the probability that a random particle selected from the system will have an energy I. The most general expression is a different one, but this added complexity is not important for my purposes. It just generalizes over all parameters. Unless you possess an instinctive mathematical faculty, you will not grasp the significance of this formula. To put it as simply as possible, although the two quantities are not equivalent, as the standard deviation of the probability distribution increases, so will the entropy. You'll notice that in the graph above, there is more total energy in the higher entropy system. I quantified the amount of energy using an interesting geometric proof in the supplementary document on the Substack. In the case of a system in which the energy is held constant, like the universe, this can't happen. However, in a system where temperature is held constant, this can. A larger number of particles also corresponds to a higher entropy. Entropy is hierarchy, since it fills as many energetic states as the system will allow. Some people describe entropy as disorder, but this definition lacks all scientific value because it defies mathematical expression. Order and disorder do not exist outside of human psychology. Does order increase with equality, or with the size and grandeur of the aristocracy? Does the Gulag Archipelago provide an example of the epitome of order, or feudal Japan? 4. A vitalist argument for voluntary human extinction. In the greatest artistic work of the 21st century, Bronze Age Mindset, Bronze Age Pervert teased out this truth perfectly. That the right wing can embrace the ordering force of chaos to oppose the school marm order of urban decay. However, he did not understand what great chaos children can create. Nemesis will arrive as a biological event, not a sociological or mystical one, and the more children Western man can have, the sooner he will arrive. Children always increase a people's capacity for spontaneity, cruelty, and waste. Schopenhauer has the same problem when he criticizes monogamy. Who cares about the benefits of polygamy to women? Also, he does not understand what great things a different artificial intelligence born in a different time and place could accomplish. Nick Land's sketches of artificial intelligence, like continuity in no future. As you speed up the industrialization simulation, you see it converge with slow motion butchery, chopping up the body into trade format interchangeable parts. The camera explores her crotch and she wriggles about. You see, I am God. Blitz images of dead astronauts. Lack all ability to conquer space and do cool shit because they do not retain any anthropomorphic attributes or only the most grotesque. It seems like eventually, because nothing confines the universe, it will trade variation in energy for variation in position and destroy everything human. However, I subjectively desire nature's elevation past humanity. Not the inevitable opposite. I want to help create Overman as cyborg, not as a cold, clinical, Hello Kitty themed talking dildo, and not as dust. The modern Bugman could never create anything as impressive as Land's continuity. Have you ever met someone who innovates with LLMs? Women dominate much of this field, and the people in it predict the imminent birth of real artificial intelligence only because they want others to perceive them as a part of something important. These people work for money and faggot status, i.e. papers in scientific journals, not for art. In the end, LLMs will benefit society because they will only replace the most spiritually plebeian occupations like trial and error science and corporate art. The abolition of man flaunts the author's skill and ambition because, instead of only critiquing any of these weak targets, he tried to critique technologies which really do allow man to overcome himself. I want to make it clear to you, most of my disagreements with Lewis's essay only concern subjective matters. If Alexander the Great, wearing a body made of silicon, landed on the beaches of LA tomorrow promising to cull humanity and launch rockets to Alpha Centauri, I would kneel at his feet, pledge my life to him, and call myself a worm. Even if he asked for the extinction of humanity and the total replacement of humanity with interesting, self-improving robots, I would still support him. Schopenhauer writes that women are the unesthetic sex, but I would go further. Both genders look this way. Perfect robot simulacrums could express anthropological vitality better than men. Humanity may never produce the kind of society that can build an extremely competent, expansive AI to dominate whatever vestiges of nature it can. However, even if we fail, you should still reject the old Tao of the West. I believe in chaos. Everywhere I look, I see massive dendritic structures clamber toward the sky. And all of us want to stand at the top, to penetrate the membrane first, even if we won't admit it to ourselves, and even if it kills us. You should question your allegiance to humanity, not because of some grand hypothetical vision, but because this line of thought can inform more imminent political choices. For instance, many on the right support India, China, Russia, and even many African countries simply because they oppose the West. Not me. I would like it if bands of adventurers invaded these nations, took their women, and forced them to stop throwing garbage into the ocean. Do you understand that 10 rivers in Africa, India, Southeast Asia, China, and Russia carry 95% of the plastic that enters the ocean? Only colonialism and conquest can solve this problem. You can't know anything about true reality, so you should question any assumptions you have. No matter how wholesome they appear, Satan could have injected them into your mind sometime in the past. Nietzsche, the cheeky cunt, wanted people to remember him as a great philosopher. so he wrote in self-aggrandizing, flowery language. However, he only deconstructed and left behind his own subjective tastes in their place. Nagarjuna, the great Buddhist philosopher, acted similarly when he made his students share their metaphysical views and then dismantled them. Lewis predicted that eventually, if the kind of deconstruction Nietzsche popularized in the Western context continues, mankind will breed an omnipotent and amoral conditioner who can decide and control humanity's future, and that their complete lack of values will present a problem which forces them into purely aesthetic choices. What an amazing problem to have. At least they would not make things boring. Wouldn't they let go of the instinct for entertainment last? Selfishness creates all beauty. Truly, one cannot conquer nature, but one can rape it and warp it to our own designs. Lewis ended his essay very elegantly. The whole point of seeing through something is to see something through it. It is good that the window should be transparent, because the street or garden beyond it is opaque. How if you saw through the garden too? It is no use trying to see through first principles. If you see through everything, then everything is transparent. But a wholly transparent world is an invisible world. To see through all things is the same as not to see. Unwittingly, he gave the most beautiful description of enlightenment that I have ever read.
The video is done now. I'm quite happy with it. It took a lot of work. This component is going to be very lazy. It's going to be me talking into the camera. So feel free to click off. Although I am quite happy with the way that the video turned out, at the same time, I find a lot of the aesthetic flourishes that I used and a lot of the content itself, honestly, to be kind of cringe. And the only reason that I'm not heavily re-editing the script is really just because I think that by the time that I publish the new improved version, I would probably also find the points cringe. When I was a teenager, everyone told me my ideas were stupid. And now that I'm an adult, I also think that my ideas as a teenager were stupid. But as a teenager, I kept in mind a valid point, which was that you can never be sure at which point in your development you actually had opinions which aligned the most with reality. Because at the age of 80, you are most likely, I would say, going to have a less accurate picture of reality than at the age of 40. Right? Where does that picture become the most clear? You have no diagnostic tool with which to assess that from yourself. It's not a question that you can really answer. The main reason that I'm making this little end part is because at the end of my last video, the 3-hour-long Hamlet analysis, I made a short video about my progress in meditation. And my idea at the time was that I was going to continue making these little end bits detailing my progress in meditation, which at the time I always aesthetically called the path. I no longer meditate. I meditated a lot, especially between making that Hamlet video, which I think I published right after a 10-day long silent meditation retreat. And then I would meditate an hour, at least an hour a day, for the next 1.5 years, I think. So I've meditated at least more than 500 hours, if not more than 1,000 hours. And the reasons why I stopped meditating, which is what I'm going to talk about, are different from the genealogy of why I stopped meditating. This is often true, I think, that the story behind why someone takes an action or doesn't take an action is profoundly connected with simply the circumstances of their lives and not anything profound like reasons. Actually, I think that man uses reason more for justification of their actions than for using it to make actions, except for in very specific circumstances like stock market picks. And even then, for most people, most of the time, I think that they use emotion just as much, if not more, than reason in circumstances like that. So I'm not going to get into the true emotional reasons why I quit meditating, but I'm going to give you my rationale instead. So I was really into this artist, Frank Yang, who did this big documentary over many videos on his channel of his path to enlightenment. And what I eventually realized was that he was lying in the sense that he was lying to himself, at least. Like, everything, all the claims he made were either false, like that meditation has effects like the powers, and that you can see the effects of meditation somehow in the empirical world, or that the double slit experiment is evidence that consciousness has some effect on physical reality directly, which is an interesting idea, but it's not what I'm going to get into. And I think that it's false. You should look into Sabine Hosfelder's videos on quantum mechanics if you want the full justification for why I think that actually consciousness is not real and does not have any effect on physical reality. But either they were like that, or they were just complete tautologies that seemed profound. What is enlightenment? Enlightenment is the realization that the self does not exist. Just in the same way that I cannot interact and transform my tendons directly. Rather I have to flex my muscles in order to do so. This sort of displays that the body and the self is actually an interacting system which is dependent as much on any one part as on any other. I could just as easily call the tendon in my arm the self as I could the brain. But this is simply tautological within any materialist worldview, right? So to the extent that Buddhism is correct, I think that it's also trite and tautological. And I think that it's wrong about the actual metaphysical claims that it makes, like that reincarnation exists. I never believed in reincarnation, but I accepted the possibility of this worldview. So I no longer believe in meditation. I no longer believe in its... I think it might have some vague mental health benefits, but I think that it could just as easily destroy your mental health. Like, what is this whole dark night of the soul? It's essentially a psychotic episode brought about by too much meditation, right? What have I replaced this Buddhist worldview with? Well, I think that you could maybe guess from the essay, which I wrote in a sort of transition period from Buddhism to my current belief system. I'm now just an atheist materialist. I no longer believe that consciousness exists at all. I no longer believe in the subject. I only believe in objects. Kant and Schopenhauer make very strong arguments that the only reason you know anything is because you are a transcendental subject, right? Your existence is inherent proof of being inherent. It's an inherent proof that consciousness exists in some way, that the subject exists in some way. But I think that this is actually an illusion. And Buddhism and a lot of meditation helped with this realization. Like when you go to sleep, your subjective mind disappears, at least during dreamless sleep. And then somehow you wake up the next day and things have changed, right? Causality has moved on without you. Objective reality does not require your sustained consciousness to continue. This is really just extremely obvious. And the ethics behind Buddhism is mostly an ethics of world denial. It's an ethics that is exactly what Nietzsche preached against, right? What is nirvana? Nirvana is a transcendental meditational state, which I have never reached, in which one attains a state like dreamless sleep immediately, right? That's a cessation. That's nirvana. It is not pleasant. It is simply the vanishing of all sensation, the vanishing of all perception. And this is what Buddhists worship. It's death. Buddhism is a death cult, ethically. I am an atheist because I think that atheism is true. I think that materialism is true. I think that only the physical world exists and that it cannot be construed as a god except in the most retarded and loose definition, the most tautological definition of God, in which, like, oh, anything that exists must be God. What's the point of this definition of God? It doesn't, you're using this as, if you use that, you're using it as a Mott and Bailey, I think, in order to say, well, God must exist. And then later you come in with these other properties of God, like omniscience, right? But Schopenhauer said that the only true God, when people say God, if they say it sincerely, they always mean a personal God. An impersonal God has no significance. People say that they need religion for things, that religion helps them with life, right? Anyone from AA, for instance, will say that they need God in order to stay sober. Without prayer, without God, they're just hooped. It's over for them. But just anecdotally, I only quit drinking. I only quit drugs after, I only quit smoking after becoming an atheist. I required the belief that no one was coming to save me and that I had to do everything in my power to make my life as good as possible, which included quitting drinking, in order to quit drinking. And I was never an addict, so I guess you could say that I don't really understand what it's like to drink every day and to be rock bottom. And people at rock bottom, they need God. But from my perspective, everyone sort of realizes that the West is without a religion, without any sort of guiding light. Liberalism offers that to some extent, but again, as I point out in the essay, liberalism is really a decayed version of Christianity, which is kind of a decayed version of Platonism. But no one has values. Values are lacking in the modern world. And Nietzsche's values, although he pointed out this problem, Nietzsche's values and his value system have not replaced the current value system to any great extent, right? But one thing that I would ask of any new value system is that it is entirely concerned with creating action in the human species. Not only did I stop meditating and did I stop drinking, but I also stopped reading so much. I've become much more interested in the activity of the body, physical activity, physical pursuits, like rock climbing. I've become much more obsessed with chasing tail. I've basically replaced my reading time with time spent studying physics. Partially this is because I have to, but I never quit drinking and I never quit drugs while I was going to Orthodox church for 6 hours a week, while I was a Buddhist meditating for an hour a day. And that's because back then I really valued my internal experience. I thought it was real in some way. My internal experience of the world. But your internal experience of the world is just some chemicals, some chemical reaction occurring in your brain somewhere, right? It has very little significance in a materialist worldview. That's why it's kind of crazy that basically all transgenders profess atheism and profess materialism. Ostensibly, they believe in a purely physical reality. And yet, the justification for transgenderism requires this immense emphasis on the internal world and on subjectivity and on the idea that you have a soul which can be wrongly configured in a body, right? It's very interesting. But one book that I have read was Jim Morrison's book. And it was surprisingly prophetic. And what it describes is the transition of the human animal from one which acts to one which watches, to a voyeur. And I think this is really true. Like, when you play video games, nothing's happening in the world, right? It's just things happening in your mind. It's just you watching things. It's just chemical reactions in a brain somewhere being stimulated by a screen. And I think that if you truly believe in atheist materialism, if you truly stop believing in a soul, if you believe that all people are merely objects, then engaging in this type of behavior becomes much more difficult. It becomes much more difficult to drink and do drugs, to smoke weed. I think weed is the worst drug because it fills your internal experience with profound things. Even if it's not pleasant, it's very profound. But at the same time, you're just sitting on a couch somewhere, right? Some people are actually, but I am never more active when I've smoked weed, right? I'm much more passive. And it's very important to me that humanity stays something that acts and not something that just watches, the universe. It's very important that humanity and that I create something in the actual physical world rather than creating pure illusions in my mind by doing something like reading, for instance.